We wanted to start out talking to you about science and wisdom because you've worked closely with His Holiness the Dalai Lama for many years in dialogues with scientists all over the world, including, of course, your role as the chair of the Mind and Life Institute. So could you talk a little bit about why you and His Holiness have put so much effort into engaging with scientists?
I mean, to be frank, it's not me, it's really His Holiness. And my engagement with scientists happened to be, to take place because of my service to His Holiness as his principal interpreter. But to be honest, at the beginning, my interest with respect to contemporary Western culture was primarily more in philosophy and literature. I wasn't that keen on science, partly because, I grew up in the monastery, and the science to me seemed very factual and quite technical. But having become His Holiness's principal English interpreter, I realized fairly soon that engagement with science and scientists was a major interest on his part, and that there was a deeper objective underlying his interest. His Holiness has had, you're all aware, had long-term friendship with the figures of 20th century science, Karl Popper, for instance, and David Bohm. And I was particularly present at several, informal dialogues between His Holiness and David Bohm. So, of course, and then, once I have appreciated deeply His Holiness's broader view and the objective and the context in which this dialogue is taking place, of course, then my own engagement became deeper.
What have scientists learned from Tibetan Buddhism's understanding of the mind through all of these dialogues?
The language of science is that of math and description in scientific language. So, and that imposes, and that has definitely a lot of strengths of rigor, intersubjectivity, verifiability, duplicability, all of that. But it also imposes a certain restrictions and limitations, which is the inability to capture what one could argue is the essential character of mind, which is the subjectivity. Science in general, and particularly scientists who are interested in studying consciousness, have really been able to have a more critical self-understanding of the limitations of current science and the challenges, that the study of consciousness poses to science itself. Because the Buddhist tradition is so rich in the mental training practices, the scientists and the clinical disciplines have the ability to really look at various types of applications and their effect and their connection with mental well-being. And there, I think, even though I characterize this as less revolutionary, but in some ways it is very revolutionary, because what is happening is that, for the first time, science, science and clinical science particularly, is able to develop and embrace therapeutic techniques that really rely heavily on the person's own agency of helping to train, helping the patients to turn their own mind into an ally towards promotion of their own mental well-being. So this is quite a radical step for clinical science, which tends to rely heavily on pharmacological interventions. So in these areas, I think, the engagement between Buddhism and science, and more specifically between His Holiness and the scientist, have had a huge impact, at the cultural practice level as well.
I'm curious if you can talk about how, your Buddhist practice, His Holiness's Buddhist practice and teachings, how has science affected your side of the equation, of the Buddhist side?
Although the basic intuition of the early Buddhist texts seem to be spot on, which is there is no beginning, and the universe is in a perpetual evolution and destruction, and then the destruction goes through a temporal stages of heating up. This broad structure or pattern of understanding the evolution seems to be fairly spot on and close to the way in which current astronomy, understands, physics and astronomy understands. But when it comes to the specific evolution of our cosmos and life on Earth, then the Darwinian evolutionary theory gives a lot more richness in detail to the content and sort of the connection between organisms like plants and so on, and between animals, the sentient creatures. And so that whole description is very rich, and there is no contradiction in Buddhism in incorporating these. So I think that on the actual practice, I know His Holiness is a big fan of quantum physics, and I think he knows far more about quantum physics than I do. I prepared just enough so that I can be in service when it comes to translating for him, so that at least I know what the kind of direction that the presenters are going, But beyond that, His Holiness had taken tutorial from von Weizsäcker, the famous German physicist. So he knows a lot, a lot more. And then His Holiness seems to take quantum physics really quite seriously, particularly the kind of the role of observer in being constitutive part of reality itself. All of this. So clearly there is some benefit that can be brought in. And also I've heard His Holiness speak of how the physics explanation of the dynamic nature of the physical world can be very helpful for understanding the Buddhist teachings on impermanence. Again, bringing a lot more richness and concreteness to the actual description of the principle of impermanence.
There's also this, I think, a similarity between science and the specifically the Nalanda tradition of Buddhism that Tibetan Buddhism comes from, with the emphasis on critical thinking and debate. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of critical thinking in, your strain of Buddhism, the one that you were trained in and you're a teacher in, and how it's similar or different from scientific criticism and skepticism.
In order for for a Dharma practice to really have an impact, it needs to be internalized. It's only through internalizing the teaching that there can be a real impact. But the internalization process would involve, processing whatever teaching you have received. And that processing cannot be done by someone else for you. It has to be done by yourself. And so some element of critical thinking, or whether we call it critical thinking or critical reflection or contemplation or, or application of a disciplined mind, whatever language we use, is kind of assumed. And then the Buddha himself has this famous example of the raft. The raft is necessary to cross the river, but once you have crossed it, you don't carry on your back, So in the same way, but without the raft, you can't cross the river. Even though in the end you need to get rid of the raft, once you reach the other shore, but that does not mean justify getting rid of the raft in the first place, right from the beginning. So I think here the Nalanda tradition is what, which is powerfully represented in the Tibetan tradition by Tsongkhapa's teaching, is to really, say that disciplined application of thought is what leads us to what Tsongkhapa calls ascertainment, ngepa. And ascertainment, it is through deepening our ascertainment, making it clear, making it more enduring, making it stronger, that we will then be able to counter its opposites, all the distorted perception of reality.
I'm curious if you can reflect on how much a Buddhist practice can be validated by science. Do you think there are limits to what science can understand about our inner reality?
We don't expect science to prove rebirth. We don't expect science to prove emptiness, even though it may be able to. But and there, I think you respect the integrity of the two sides, the Buddhist tradition and its agenda, its objectives, and science, its agenda, its discipline, its tradition. And that, I think, is a healthy way, where there is a genuine mutual respect and dialogical encounter, and no urge to reduce the other into one's own paradigm.
I was really struck by a lecture you gave at George Washington University a couple of years ago that I was watching recently, where you talk about how ethics is optional in Western society, and how part of your goal in your life is to maybe make ethics less of an option and more of a requirement in culture and society. Can you talk a little bit about that, and maybe what society might look like if it integrated ethics and compassion more into our culture or even our laws? I mean, and is your role in the Compassion Institute, where you're the co-founder there, is that part of your of fulfilling this goal?
My own personal kind of vision for Compassion Institute is to really help make real part of His Holiness's vision for the world, which is to find ways to make compassion active and real, and not just in individual human lives, but actually in society.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things about compassion is that increasingly, and this is one area where His Holiness has made a huge contribution, which is to naturalize the language of compassion. Because up until recently, compassion is seen as a moral value, it's part of religious teaching, so, and sort of quite removed from science and quite removed from everyday human kind of condition. And His Holiness has made really great efforts to, in some sense, sort of extricate the compassion and the language around it from religion, from traditional religion particularly, and even from morality, moral language, and to ground it as a fundamental aspect of human nature, human condition. Effective neuroscience, which is the study of emotions from a neuroscientific perspective, is a new field. And now there is, growing appreciation of the social dimension of human nature. And there's something called social neuroscience. So it's a science itself is progressing. And part of the reason why it has taken long is when it comes to social aspects of the human being, like compassion and so forth, then you have to understand these only in the context of relationality. The more science is able to find correlation for specific mental states, the more it becomes easier to then study it, refine the concept, and then find a way to apply it in the context of interventions and therapeutic practices.